somebody asked, the 800-171 Appendix E NFO controls are not specifically addressed in CMMC documentation. How does that play into a CMMC assessment? And the answer that was given was not good. They basically said, well, the NFO controls are hidden in CMMC language.
Yep.
Like it's a riddle, right? Like it's
Where's
a
Waldo,
scavenger
right?
hunt.
Yep.
Like all I do is talk about the importance of NFO controls. I mean, we'll talk about coming up, just today, NIST released their summary of comments submitted to 800-171 for the upcoming revision. And the overwhelming topic was dealing with these NFO controls. It's all I talk about. And somebody said, hey, okay, like NFO controls exist, so how does this play into an assessment? Just to clarify for everybody, right? The 800-171 standard is the set of requirements that's being assessed by the CMMC program by and large. CMMC level 1 is a small subset of requirements. CMMC level 3 is an additional set of enhancements to 171. The center of gravity, the essence of CMMC, the lion's share of all of what we're talking about runs right through 800-171. So understanding 800-171 and its structure and development lets you understand the CMMC program overall. 800-171 is a derivative of a larger standard known as 853. Specifically, the moderate baseline selection of controls out of the 853 catalog were dissected and pulled apart and tailored down into a much smaller subset, which we now call 800-171. The process of going from the 262 853 controls down to the much smaller subset of 800-171 requirements occurred by NIST doing what was called tailoring, making certain assumptions about what was in place so that they could take those requirements out of the main body. Now, this causes a huge problem because the intent of NIST was to make this as non-bureaucratic as possible, to make it as lightweight and high level as possible so that you don't get weighed down with the heavy detail of 853 controls because you already are a business that is operating an information system, dealing with data flow, interested in protecting your own sensitive data. All of these things already exist. You're not starting from scratch. So you don't need all of the detail that exists in 853 to tell you how to start from scratch. Well, that caused a huge problem because, as we know, when you start to require people in the industrial base and other supply chain sectors to implement 800-171, they all go, we don't have any of that stuff in place. We don't have all of these sort of precursor basics in place. So you're asking us to sort of start on third base, and we haven't even swung at the pitch yet effectively. Okay. So the NFO controls are a specific subset of controls that are documented in the back of 800-171 in Appendix E. And these are all of the things that NIST feels represent a more holistic approach to an overall information security program, but that they assume are already implemented and therefore don't need to be specified. For instance, all of the policy and procedure controls, right, that NIST would normally say you have to have policy and procedure controls because one of the main things that you're doing when you try to verify a control implementation is saying, is it operating in accordance with what I want to have happen? Is it operating in accordance with our management decisions that we've documented in organizational policy? If you don't have organizational policy documented, then you don't know if the control is operating the way you intended it to. It's operating according to the way the vendor told you to. It's operating according to defaults. Like, what is it? Why is that control functionality in place? Why are you spending money on this security control and this security functionality if it doesn't map back to something that you want to have happen, which is normally documented in policy? So none of the policy and procedure controls are specified in 800-171. None of the management of outsourced external providers is specified in 800-171. And this causes a whole range of problems because 75% of the industrial base are small businesses, and most small businesses outsource their IT and or security function. So if you built a set of controls that says we assume that if you outsourced these controls, of course you would have done something to manage the terms and conditions, the SLAs that you have with your managed service provider and your IT, your outsourced IT. Of course you would have done that. Like, you wouldn't have signed a contract for an outsourced group of people to have administrative and security access into your organization without having controlled that interface, right? You know, from NIST's perspective, of course that makes sense. Turns out that's not actually true at all. And so when an assessor shows up and you are starting on third base, they have to ask you for a bunch of information that isn't specified as a requirement, but you can't necessarily evaluate the controls without. So for instance, part of the reason why all of this training converging on assessment objectives is so important is that every assessment objective follows the same pattern, right? The very beginning of an assessment objective has some sort of policy check. They're going to make sure that some parameter was defined or documented or specified or written down somewhere in some form of documentation or policy. The rest of the assessment procedure is evaluating whether or not the functionality matches what you've documented. So if you don't have the documentation, then you don't know what you're assessing against. And so the assessment can't happen. That's a huge problem because documentation is not a specified requirement. So what ends up happening is CMMC assessors show up and they go, okay, we're here to evaluate the functionality of your control environment. Show us your policies. And people go, well, we don't have policies. And they go, well, then what is your control environment doing?
This is a hill that I think since the day that we met, this is a hill that I've been standing on, right? I personally was taught in college. I personally was taught in college that it is absolutely asinine for you to set up any kind of reoccurring process or to establish any sort of business processes without documentation to support the continuing execution of those processes, right? It's the same example here. These are business processes that need to be intertwined in. They just happen to deal with cybersecurity or tasks that you need to perform. Yeah. And so what happened is that out of all the good that may have come from switching from 1.0 to 2.0, what happened is that what they did was remove the requirement to assess how good your policies and procedures were or how effective the policies and procedures were. And people mistakenly thought that meant that they don't need to exist any longer. And that's not the case.